Hi guys, welcome to Short Skirts and Sarcasm. I'm Caroline, and today I will tell you all about my favorite podcasts, and if you like those podcasts, you should read these books that I will recommend. So as you can see, I'm also wearing a t-shirt that says Vodka and Revenge, best served cold, and it is a t-shirt from the Missed in History, Stuff You Missed in History class podcast, which I love. I've been listening for years, and they have cool t-shirts. So I will, because I'm going to talk about a lot of different podcasts, I will make a Medium blog post that has all the podcasts, all the links, and all of the books I'm going to talk about, and I will link that in the description below, so you have a blog post and that has everything on it if you want to read that. So moving on, my first podcast on the list is Behind the Bastards, and this is a podcast hosted by Robert Evans, and every week he sits down with a guest who comes in cold, and he tells them all about the worst people in all of history, and it's very funny, it's very entertaining. So the book that I have chosen to go with Behind the Bastards is Beauty Queens by Libba Bray. And Beauty Queens is a ridiculous Lord of the Flies retelling, but instead of British schoolboys, it is American teen girls who are part of a teenage beauty pageant. And so this is a hilarious book. It's supposed to be completely ridiculous and satirical, so you do have to suspend your disbelief because a lot of it just is not realistic at all. It's just supposed to be funny, and it really is. So I would recommend Beauty Queens by Libba Bray. And the next podcast is called Germany Memories of a Nation. So this is a podcast that no longer has new episodes coming out, but it's hosted by Neil Gregor, and they're very short episodes, and they go through parts of German history. So like there's an episode on the Bauhaus, and there's an episode on Albrecht Dürer, and it usually centers around a piece of art or a historical artifact. And I really love these. I think that Neil Gregor has a very nice voice. For this podcast, I have chosen the book Till by Daniel Kehlmann, and this came out last year, and it was nominated for the International Man Booker Prize. It did not win, but I read it and I really enjoyed it. So this is a book that centers on the character Till Eulenspiegel, which is a part of German folklore. And Daniel Kehlmann has taken this character and reimagined him and made a novel featuring this character from folklore, and I thought it was really good. It's set, I think, in the 30 Years' War. So I know I've said multiple times on this channel that that's not my area of history, but I made an exception for this book because I am familiar with the folklore around Till Eulenspiegel, and I was excited to see a new iteration of this character. So I would recommend that one. Next on the podcast list is Hidden Djinn, and this is a podcast hosted by Rabia Chaudhry, and she essentially goes through all the mythology and folklore associated with jinn, who you might also call genies, but jinn is the proper name for it. And my book recommendation for this one is The Djinn Falls in Love. And this is an anthology of short stories that all all incorporates a djinn in it. And so they vary in length, they vary in setting, in time. And I thought it was very, very imaginative, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm usually not a short stories person. I oftentimes, ironically, find them too long. But I did really enjoy this short story collection. I enjoyed some more than others. I can't recall off the top of my head which ones were my favorite, but this is a collection that did stay in my mind, and I think about it from time to time. So next is Lolita Podcast, and this is a podcast that is all about the book Lolita and the author Vladimir Nabokov and the cultural legacy and the pop cultural legacy that this book has had. And I'm sure when you hear me say Lolita, the book, you immediately call to mind a specific image or a few images. And this podcast really delves into why we associate those images with Lolita and with the book, and really does a deep dive. I think there's 11 episodes in total, and this is a podcast hosted by Jamie Loftus. And Jamie Loftus is also sometimes a guest on Behind the Bastards. So if you listen to Behind the Bastards, you might know her from there. And for the book, I am choosing My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. And this is similar to Lolita. It is a book about child abuse. So if you don't want to hear about child sexual abuse, I do not recommend that you read My Dark Vanessa or listen to Lolita Podcast. So My Dark Vanessa follows Vanessa, who is 15 and she goes to a boarding school, and there she starts, or rather a teacher starts a relationship with her, and it's in dual timelines. It is one when she's at school in this relationship, what she thinks is a relationship, and the other timeline is when she is, I think, 27 and she's an adult, and she is coming to terms with the fact that she has been abused. And it's really interesting, and I also think it's really realistic. Because she goes back and forth with feeling that her relationship was a relationship, and then, coming more to terms with the fact that she was abused and it wasn't a consensual or ethical relationship. And my next podcast is Myths and Legends, and this is, it's hosted by Aaron Mahnke, and it's all about myths and legends. Every week we get to hear about a new legend or myth or fairy tale, and it might be something that you already know or think you know, but the way Aaron Mahnke tells these stories is really engaging and entertaining, as well as informative. And the book I've chosen for this is Smoke and Mirrors by Neil Gaiman. And this is another short story collection. I know I just said that I don't like short stories, but I do make exceptions for Neil Gaiman. And I think what makes Neil Gaiman so special is his humor in his storytelling. And I think that really matches up to the tone of Myths and Legends. And my next podcast is Sentimental Garbage. So this podcast is about books, and it is hosted by author Caroline O'Donoghue. And all of the books that are featured on this podcast, of those that I have read, they are all amazing books. But I did not cheat. I didn't choose any of those. So this podcast is all about, I think the tagline is The Chick Lit Who Made Us Who We Are. It's all books written by women, mostly for women, things that might be written off as chick lit to make it seem like it's less serious. Caroline O'Donoghue and a guest go through a book that they will both read and talk about it and analyze it. And sometimes it is a frivolous book or something that seems like a frivolous book, but upon closer reflection, it is actually pretty deep. And I would urge you to check out all the books that they mention on this podcast. I love it. But the book that I have chosen to go with this is the book My Cup Runneth Over. I know I've talked about this before, and it's about a girl. I think she's 14. She's in secondary school, and she's coming to terms with herself and her body, and she believes that she should be thinner, and when she is thinner, everything will fall into place. But by the end of this, she she decides that she is perfect the way she is. So the back of this says, Angelica cooks and pots, has the most divine life, divine friends, divine family, divine housekeeper who makes the most lovely custard tarts. True, her friends can be so perfect it hurts, and her mother is an annoyingly skinny ex-model type, but they are so delightful that Angel forgives their perfections. What is not so delightful is that Angel feels like a big wobbly whale whenever she is around said friends, family, and custard tart creator. And with the school fashion show quickly approaching, Angel is determined to make life changes by starting a new healthy diet, sans tarts. Adam, the school hottie, is sure to be at the show. If Angel can just get Adam to notice her, she knows he'll fall hopelessly, madly, totally in love, and he'll realize that there's more to Angelica Cooks and Pots than her delightful friends, family, and custard tarts. In fact, Angel is rather divine herself. And again, by the end of this, she also realizes she doesn't need this Adam dude's approval. She approves of herself, and that's what's important. As I have mentioned in previous videos, this is one of the books that I brought to London with me when I moved here, and I only brought 6 books, and this is one of them, and I love it, and I will never give up that copy. And it is criminally underrated. I have never met anyone who has read this book, and I think that is a shame. So read it. It's amazing. My next podcast is Sparkletac, and it is a podcast that is no longer running. It's about San Francisco history, and all the episodes are very short, bite-sized, they're delightful. It ranges from things like the history of the Coit Tower and who commissioned that building and her effect on San Francisco history, especially on the fire department, and it also goes through botanical gardens and stuff like that. So the book I have chosen to go with that is Frog Music by Emma O'Donoghue. And this book is set in San Francisco in the 1800s, and it follows a French singer and dancer and her friendship with Genie, a scandalously trousers wearing woman who makes no effort to fit into the ideal of femininity that was at that time. And it starts with Jenny's murder, and the main character decides that she's going to find out who killed her friend. And it flashes back over their friendship, which lasted maybe about 18 months, and how Jenny helped her when things got tough with her husband, and when she was having issues with her child. And this is a pretty sad book, and it does have abuse in it, and it does have obviously murder in it, and it is very frustrating to see the main character who essentially gets things taken from her just because she's a woman, and that sucks to read. So if you don't want that depressing read, I wouldn't recommend it. But if you're okay with reading about some sad things, I think it's a really powerful and memorable book, and so I would recommend it. And next on my list is Stuff You Missed in History Class, where I got this shirt. And I've mentioned it on this channel before. I do love Stuff You Missed in History Class. The premise is basically that there's a lot of history that you weren't taught in school in history class, and the hosts, Tracy V. Wilson and Holly Fry, basically find lesser known people and events and tell you about them in 25 to 45 minute episodes. And this podcast has been running since I think 2008. So Holly and Tracy are not the original hosts. There have been several hosts of this podcast. So there's a giant back archive, and I think they're now hosted on iHeartRadio. They used to be part of How Stuff Works, but I don't think they are anymore. And so you can find all of their episodes on the iHeartRadio website and presumably app. So the book I have chosen to put in with this podcast is Bananas, Beaches, and Bases, Making Feminist Sense of International Politics by Cynthia Enloe. So this is one of my favorite books ever. As you can see, it is well loved. And it's also, it's also signed. I had the amazing good fortune to see Cynthia Enloe. She gave a talk at King's College London in, I think, late 2019 or early 2020. I can't remember. And it was to celebrate her new book, which is called The Big Push, which I do also have. And I took this book with me and I asked her to sign it, and she, bless her, was so excited. I was like, oh, I'm so sorry, this copy is so battered, and she said, no, you've made it your own. I can see that it's well loved, and that meant so much to me. I was so happy. When I was in my second year of undergrad, I had an amazing seminar leader, and she is now my friend and has her own YouTube channel, so I will link her down below. Her name's Miriam Mahmood. And I was asking her questions about an essay that I was supposed to write for her class to do with feminism and women. And she said, okay, well, you have to go back to bananas, beaches, and bases. And I was like, what? And she was like, bananas, beaches, and bases. And I was like, what? And she was like, you have to read this book. And so I was like, okay, I guess I will. So I got it from the library, and I was like, Miriam is right. This book is amazing. And so, I mean, as the subtitle says, Making Feminist Sense of International Politics. And this is all about how seemingly small, personal, domestic things uphold international society and international politics, and how something like who cleans your house and who cleans hotel rooms is both a symptom of and upholds the way our entire international structure works. So thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Cynthia. I love this book, and I have come back to it numerous times when I have written about other things in international history and international relations. Moving on, my next podcast is the Bowery Boys New York City History, and this is a podcast hosted by Greg Myers and Tom Young. No, Greg Young and Tom Myers. And it is about New York City history. And so these two guys, they sit down together and they will tell you about New York City history. And sometimes it is something that is really well known, like the elevated trains or the Met Museum. And sometimes it is things that are less well known. And I think their latest podcast, when I'm filming, is the first part of the birth of Harlem, and Harlem as a predominantly Black neighborhood. So that it's always really interesting, and the hosts are very personable, and they have nice voices, and they're also very funny and entertaining. So I would definitely recommend that. And for the book, I have The Golem and the Genie by Helena Wecker, and this is set in New York in the 1890s, so it is my kind of history, 19th century, and it is about a golem and a genie, and they live in neighboring New York City immigrant neighborhoods. So the genie lives in Little Syria and the golem lives in a Jewish neighborhood, and they become friends because they are both non-human but human presenting creatures. They both have that as their secret identity no one can know, and so they find camaraderie in this. And it's a long book. It's 600-ish pages, I think, and it's a very slow burn. And they have a really beautiful friendship. It takes quite a while for them to even meet, so this prepared to have like a very, very slow story. But in the end, it does really heat up, and it has a pretty interesting, adventurous, heart-pounding, high-stakes climax. So it's beautifully written. I read it this past December in 2020, and I loved it. It was one of my favorite books of 2020. Moving on, The Teacher's Pet. This is a true crime podcast in Australia. It is about a teacher who is suspected of murdering his wife, and no, not their children, just his wife, or rather his ex-wife, I guess now. And part of the problem is that there's no body, so that she's technically missing and not necessarily murdered. So it is a podcast that is presented by The Australian, and it's an investigative journalism podcast. And there are so many layers. I was hooked. I was so sad when it was over, and I haven't kept track of this case, so I'm not sure if there have been any new developments in it, but I'd recommend that podcast. And for the book, I would recommend Picnic at Hanging Rock, which is also an Australian mystery. It is fiction though. So it's set in 1900 in early colonial Australia, and it is at a posh girls' school, and some of the girls and some of the teachers go for a picnic at Hanging Rock for the day, and it's set on Valentine's Day, and I think they say that Valentine's Day was a Sunday, and if you look at actual calendars, Valentine's Day in 1900 did not fall on a Sunday, so it's very clearly not from real life. It is purely fiction, but it feels very real. So these girls and some of the teachers disappear, and I think one of the girls is found, but she can't remember anything because she's had heat stroke. And so it's looking at this girls' school and how colonial society is trying to impose a European societal structure on Australia, and how that's difficult to do, and why also that's not a good idea to do, because colonialism has left a pretty nasty legacy everywhere it's been. And so, I mean, it's about a disappearance, and you can just read it as that, but in my opinion, it is much deeper. It is a critique of the colonial enterprise itself. So it has layers, it's a mystery, and it's very, very juicy, and I would recommend it. I have not seen the movie or TV adaptation. I don't even know what it is with Natalie Dormer. I do want to watch it because I love Natalie Dormer, but I haven't yet. So next on my list is Wait, Don't Tell Me, and this is an NPR radio segment, and it's pretty famous. I'm sure you've heard of it, especially if you live in the US. But it's a news quiz hosted by Peter Sagal and Bill Curtis. And they have a panel, usually of comedians, and they ask the panel questions about the news, and they also ask listener contestants questions about the news, and it's usually ridiculous news, and it's very funny. Every time I listen to this, I have to make sure I'm not in public because I will laugh and giggle, and if I'm taking a walk in the park, I look like a lunatic, so I try to listen and laugh at home. And so the book I have for this is Love Among the Chickens by P.G. Wodehouse, and it's a very long time since I've read this book, and I would like to read it again. And it's not what P.G. Wodehouse is famous for, which is of course the Bertie Wooster series, and I do have some of these. This one is Stiff Upper Lip Jeeves. It doesn't follow the characters of Bertie Wooster and Jeeves. It follows a man called Youre, and I've forgotten the main character's name, but essentially the main character is a sensible but slightly weak-willed person who has this friend Youre, who I think in this has just gotten married to someone. And Youre has all these harebrained schemes, and he's like, well, we're going to start a chicken farm, and it's going to be great. And so this guy goes along with his very confident friend, even though none of them have any experience in chicken farming. And so they try to set up this chicken farm, and it goes terribly wrong, and it's so funny. And the main character is also trying to get in the good graces of this girl he sees and immediately falls in love with. I think her name is Phyllis. And so that's another added storyline of comedy. And so it's so funny. I would really recommend it. And my second to last podcast is You Must Remember This. And it is a history podcast focused on Hollywood and the movie industry, mostly early Hollywood. So it's maybe like the early 1900s up until the 1970s. It's hosted by Karina Longworth, and she has also a very relaxing voice. I love listening to her voice, and the podcast subjects are always so interesting. It's usually stories that you have not heard before. And there is also a mini series on the Manson family and the Manson murders. So if you're into true crime, I would listen to that as well. And the book I have picked out for this podcast is 8 Girls Taking Pictures. And it's not really, it reads like a short story collection, essentially. It's a book that has 8 sections. On the surface, they don't connect. They are all about women photographers. And they are based on real people. So for example, there's like Lee Miller, but it's a fictionalized version of Lee Miller, if that makes sense. So the 8 girls who take pictures, they represent real people, even though like their names and some of the details are different. And there were some chapters I liked in this more than others. So for example, the Lee Miller chapter was my favorite, which is why I remember it. So I read this a few years ago, but it still sticks with me, especially the Lee Miller one. And a cool thing that is in this book is that every chapter has an example of a picture that is one of the pictures of the original female photographer, and the picture is then mentioned in the chapter. So a lot of these women don't like interact, at least in this book, but it's still really interesting and really nice. And I think the theme works very well. And so this is the last podcast I will talk about. I know I have been talking about podcasts and books for quite a while now, but it is my favorite podcast. It is You're Wrong About. This podcast is hosted by Sarah Marshall and Michael Hobbs, and it is looking back on historical events or people that have been misremembered or not remembered at all, and goes back and talks about why they were misremembered and why it's important to set the record straight and know the real story. And it's funny and informative. This is a theme on my podcast list. I love funny and informative podcasts. And it also is just unlike any other podcast I've ever listened to. It's so empathetic, and I never get tired of this podcast. I finished the entire back catalog. I found out about this podcast about a year ago, and I've listened to every single episode at least 3 times, and some of them I've listened to maybe 50 times. I do have my favorites, and that I think my favorite episode ever is the Iran-Contra scandal episode. And the book I have for this podcast is Stiff: The Curious Life of Human Cadavers by Mary Roach, which is also funny and informative. Mary Roach is one of my favorite nonfiction authors. Her writing style is so funny, and she essentially finds a thing that she's kind of interested in and researches it to death. Researches it to death. Pun unintended. But Stiff is an oddly compelling, often hilarious exploration of the strange lives of our bodies post-mortem. For 2,000 years, cadavers, some willingly, some unwittingly, have been involved in science's boldest strides and weirdest undertakings. In this fascinating account, Mary Roach visits the good deeds of cadavers over the centuries and tells the engrossing story of our bodies when we are no longer with them. This has to do with like medical school dissection and body farms that research how bodies decompose, and practice heads for plastic surgeons, and many, many other things. Like this, I mean, it seems like it would be a very morbid and sad subject, but Mary Roach makes it interesting, makes it funny, and she's always got great footnotes. I've read 3 Mary Roach books, but this is the second one I've read, and they're all amazing. I would recommend literally everything that Mary Roach has written, but I think this one is my favorite. So that is it. We have talked for quite a while about how I love podcasts and how I love books, and this isn't even all the podcasts I listen to. I have a real podcast problem, but I'm sure I will see you soon. Link down below will be all the podcasts I've talked about and all the books I've talked about, because I've talked about quite a few. Don't expect you to remember and take notes of them all. And of course, all my social media that you can follow me on. And I will see you next time. Bye.